So this is the Daf Yomi for Shabbos Kodesh. We're studying it on Friday, and Daf is Shevuos 16, dedicated for Shemer for the Chayalim, Matzah for the Shmiyim, and Yeshua for Am Yisrael. The Gemara is discussing that we have a whole procession that was necessary to consecrate the temple, and the Tosefes, the additions to the Jerusalem and additions to the courtyard of the temple. And if you didn't do, it says in the Mishnah, whoever does not do all of these things, then if they haven't done everything in the procession, the king, the prophet, the Ramatumim, the Kohen Gadol, the Navi, then we're going to say that it is not consecrated, and so therefore he's not liable if he went there tamei. So Imar Rapuna taught the kol elutanan, that you need to do all of these things, meaning to say, if you're missing even one of the stipulations listed in the Mishnah, you're not liable if you enter into it. It comes along Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, "Ba'achas mikol elutanan." You just need one of these things listed in the Mishnah, but not all of these things. And so, if you had one of these things, then you're going to be liable if you, excuse me, then you're going to be liable if you went in there into this addition. So the Gemara says, what's the source of this dispute between Rav Huna says you need all of them, Rav Nachman says you need just one of them? Rav Nachman Amar B'Kol Eutanam. Rav Nachman says you need all of these things. Kasavar, he saw the position. Rishona, when Jerusalem was consecrated through David and Shlomo, Kitcho Shaita, it was consecrated for that moment. The Kitcho Asalavo, and even after the temple was destroyed, it remained its. It retained its holiness. And so since the holiness was not canceled with the destruction, therefore you don't really need to consecrate it again when they return from the exile. Ezra just did a reminder of just to remind us, but it was not from the laws of consecration. And so therefore Rav Nachman says, Ba'achas mikol elutanan. Rav Nachman says, you just need one of these things. So he says the consecration was for that moment, but not for the future. Ezra Kiddushay Kaddish, and Ezra did a real consecration. And so therefore, and Ezra, when he consecrated it, it was consecrated even though we didn't have the Urim V'Tumim. And so therefore, we see from here that you don't need to have all of these things in order to consecrate it, because So therefore, since he didn't have the Urim Tumim, was Ezra's consecration a valid consecration? So since it was a valid consecration, even if you just have one of these things, you're able to consecrate it. Esvei Rava or Rav Nachman, we say, it says in our Mishnah, Kol Shel Nasis B'Koel. Doesn't our Mishnah say who doesn't consecrate it with all of these things? And Gemara says, Tani Ba'achas B'Koel. No, read it as one of these things, not all of these things. Tashma, come and learn from the Brisa. Abba Shol says, Shnei bitzin hayu b'har mishcha. There were two eggs. Excuse me, not eggs. That's a mistake that actually appears other places in Shas. A beitza is not an egg. That's an example of the Gemara says. That's an example why you can't teach anything unless you know the halacha. Because they said mei bitzayim. The bitzayim here are two swamps. There were two like ditches or a place of where the water gathers in a part of it because it collects. It pools there. So there are basically two pools in on Mount Olives, Tachtona Velion, and both of them are on a slant on the mountain. One was higher than the other. Tachtona Niskadsha B'Koelu. One was consecrated with all of these things. Ella B'Koelu, and Eliona one is Kadsha B'Koelu. The upper one was not consecrated with all these things. Ella B'Oleagolev. It was consecrated only during the time of the second temple. Shalom B'Melach for Shalom B'Urim. The time of the second temple, they didn't have a king. And they didn't have the Urim V'Tumim, and so therefore it wasn't applicable. Tachtona Shaisa Kedusha Gemura Ame Aretz Nechnasam Hashem Ochen Sham Kodesh Kalim. So the lower one, which was consecrated with all these things, the people would go there and eat the sacred food, that needs to be in Jerusalem. The chaver and ochel sham kachim kalam avalo meiser sheni, but they wouldn't eat the meiser sheni because they tried to keep meiser sheni ideally, and so therefore they went into the inner walls. Whereas the chaverim, the talmid chamen, hayu ochel sham kachim kalam meiser sheni, and they said since it was completely holy, they could even eat the meiser sheni there. Al Yonah shalaisa kedushasa gemura, but the Al Yonah, the top one, which does not have the complete holiness, because they didn't consecrate it all these ways. Amei Aretz would eat there the kachikalim, the lesser holiness, but avalo meiser sheni, but not the meiser sheni. Chaverin inochon shamo kachim kalim or meiser sheni. So the chaverim wouldn't even eat there the kachikalim, and also not the meiser sheni. Why didn't they consecrate it completely? And so, because you can only add on with if you have a king, a prophet, or a Metulim, Sanhedrin, and the two dodos and the song. And when they went up from the exile, they didn't have all these things. So therefore, when they consecrated, it was not a complete consecration. And so, therefore, if that's the case, so why did they consecrate it? What do you mean, why did they consecrate it? You just said they didn't. Why did they add it on to the city with a wall and consecration? So why did they do it? So the Gemara says, because since it was a place that was revealed of Jerusalem, and it was very easily able to be conquered from there. And so therefore, they considered it part of Jerusalem. And so they added on, even though basically they were saying that later on they'll come and fully consecrate it. But anyway, we see from here that the Kedusha, it's not a complete Kedusha, only if you fulfill all these things, but they didn't fulfill all these things. So the Gemara says Tanai. So this is a Machokes Tanaim, that whether or not you need all these things or just one of these things. Tanya Rabbi Lezer, Shamati Shah, Kashayubonan Hechel, when they would build the Azara, I heard. Also, Kulayim, they made curtains for the partition, Hechel, for the place in place of the walls that were not yet built. Kulayim Lazaros, and they also did curtains for the courtyard. But in the sanctuary, they would build the curtains outside. Bazaros bonim bifnim, and in the courtyard they would make the curtains inside. They would build it from the inside. In Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Shamati, Shemakrivin Alpha Pishaim Bayis. I know you could bring sacrifices in the place of the temple, even though there's no temple anymore. Meaning to say, what the walls fell down. And you could eat the sacred food, even though there's no curtains. I know you could eat the kachikalim and the meiser sheni, even though there's no wall. Because it was consecrated forever. So doesn't this prove that Rabbi Lezer says it wasn't consecrated forever? And so therefore, since it was nullified, so as long as there's no bias, you can't build it. And therefore they made the curtains in place of the walls of the sanctuary in order to say that the Azara can now be brought before they completed. I'm like, how do you know that that's the argument? Maybe everybody says it was consecrated for the first generation also forever. And each one of them was just saying what they heard from their rabbis. Rabbi Yeshua is not arguing Rabbi Lezer, because Rabbi Lezer was not talking about it at all about how long it was consecrated for. And if you want to say the curtains for Rabbi Lezer, what's the reason for it? It's niusa ba'alma. It's just for the purpose of modesty, so that it would not be open and revealed. So therefore, the Gemara says it's not necessarily machokas tanaim. So the Gemara says Elahani tonight. These are the ones who argue about whether or not kedusha rishon is kitchel shaita and kitchel asilavo. Tanya Amar b'Shmuel bar Rabbi Yossi Lama manu chachamim es ha'elu. Why in the Mishnah Erechim does the Mishnah count those cities that were surrounded by a wall from the time of Joshua? There were more cities. The reason is when the people of the diaspora went up, Matsu Elu Kitchum, they went up and consecrated them. Of Rishonos Batlu, but the original cities, the other cities, Batlu Misha Batlu Aretz, they lost their holiness. So Alma Kasavar, we see from here Kutcha Rishona, Kitcha Lashaita, we see that it wasn't consecrated forever. Gemara says, but Veramini, I'm Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossi, V'chi Elu Bavada, you were these the only ones that were holy. Alok Var Nemer. Shishimir Kol Chava Argog Malchas Olam Bashim Kol Ela Arim Betzuros Kol Makvo. All of these were walled cities. Lama Manu Chachamim say, why the sages count these cities? Shekisha'alu B'nei Agoa Matzu Ela V'Kitchen. When the B'nei Agoa went up, these children, they found them and they consecrated. So we see that there's another brisa. Gemara says, "Kitchem hashta." When did they consecrate them? Didn't we say you don't need to? So it means that they found these and they counted them. Not only these, anything that will go up in your hand that's a tradition from your fathers that's surrounded from time of Joshua, all these mitzvos that apply to those cities apply also because the first holiness was Kitchel Shaita and also for the future. So anyway, the Gemara says, well, Kasha de Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yossi de Rabbi Shmuel bar Yossi. This is in fact a contradiction in Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yossi because between the first brisa and this brisa. First brisa says it was not consecrated forever. And in the second brisa, it says it was. So the first explanation is possible the two Tanaim are arguing about Rabbi Shmuel bar Yossi. One of them was not said by Rabbi Shmuel bar Yossi, but was said through Rabbi Elazar bar Yossi. Rabbi Elazar bar Yossi Omer, it says in the pasuk in Vayikra, that's next week's parsha, Asher Lo Choma. It's spelled with we read it low, even though it's written Lamed Aleph, which implies it does not have a wall. To teach us, even if it doesn't have a wall now, it had one prior to this. So he says that Kitcha Rishana, Kitcha La'aselav, according to that approach. And now it's a obviously very deep sugya. We'll go into it much more tomorrow in understanding it, God willing. And now we're up to the top of 16b. Nidma ba'azara v'ne'alma mimenatuma. Let's say there's another great piece. Let's say he's in the courtyard, he becomes tamei, and he forgot that he was tamei, and he bowed down or waited there the time it takes to bow down. So then he has to go out the shortest way possible. So the Gemara clarifies the source that even if you became tamei in the azara, you're liable even if you just wait there for the amount of time it takes to bow down. Tuma ba'azar mino. And how do you know if a person becomes tamei in the courtyard? How do you know he's liable if he waits there? Rabbi Elazar Kasuv Echad Omer. One verse says this Mishkan Hashem Timei, he has defiled the Mishkan. The Kasuv Echad Omer ki es Mikdash Hashem Timei. Another verse says he caused God's sanctuary to become defiled. And do we have any extra verses? We need both of them. The time Rabbi Elazar Omer Nemar Mishkan, Lama Nemar Mikdash. One verse says Mishkan. What does the next one say? Mikdash. Nemar Mikdash, Lama Nemar Mishkan. So Iu Nemar Mishkan, one Nemar Mikdash. If it said Mishkan and not Mikdash, Ayisi Omer Mishkan Yechayev. I might have thought you were only liable for the Mishkan. Sharei Mashuach V'Shem Mishkan, because that was anointed to Shem Mishkan. Mikdash Lomachayev, but not on the temple because it was not anointed. If Nemar Mikdash or Nemar Mishkan, if it says the Mikdash and not the Mishkan. I used to Omer on Mikdash Yechayev, Shari Kedusha, so Kedusha Solam. I would have said that a Mikdash Yechayev because it's consecrated forever. On Mishkan lo yechayev, and not on the Mishkan because it's not forever. Kachnam on Mishkan will kachnam on Mikdash. That's what it says both. So the Gemara says. Rabbi Eliezer, so Rabbi Eliezer was bothered by this. Miltei Mishkan Ikri Mikdash, Mikdash Ikri Mishkan. Since both of them are called by the other name, the Mishkan is called the Mikdash, and the Mikdash is called the Mishkan. Miltei Vo Idi V'Idi Mikdash, or Idi Mishkan. Mishkan and Mikdash only. He could have just written the same word twice. Why does it switch it up? Shema Minatati. So we see from him two things: both the law of if you became tummy inside, and also both the Mishkan and the Mikdash are included in this obligation. Bishlam and Mikdash Ikri Mishkan. So we want to first analyze this. I know that the Mikdash is called the Mishkan. I'll place my Mishkan amongst you, and that's called the Mikdash. Al Mishkan Ikri Mikdash. I don't know the Mishkan is called the Mikdash. That's referring to the ark. From here, also in Mikdash was Shachanti B'Socham. So we see both the Mishkan is called the Mikdash, and the Mikdash is called the Mishkan. And if you bow down, if you became tummy in the sanctuary, and you bow down or you wait the time it takes to bow down, you're going to be liable. Amarava, Roshanu, this law that you're liable for bowing down, even if you quickly got out, it's when he bowed down towards the sanctuary. But if he bowed down on his way out, he's only liable if he waited there the length of time. Some say that this refers to the concluding clause. He waited there the time it takes to bow down. This teaches us that bowing down itself requires the amount of time it takes to bow down. It means that Shtachava has an amount of time. And only if you do that, if you bow down for that amount of time, you're liable. Amarava Roshanu, that's only if you bow down outside. If you do it towards the inside, even if you didn't wait, you're going to be liable. If you bow down towards the inside, or you waited the amount of time it takes to bow down, that is the amount of time. What is the amount of time that you're liable for? The amount of time it takes to bow down. If you waited while you bow down outside, the amount of time it takes to bow down, you're going to be liable. What's the amount of time that you bow down? What is the amount of time that you're not liable? If you just regularly bow. The Ispeshia, what's the amount of time where you are liable? Where you completely spread out on the floor. That's called a bowing down that you'd be liable for. The Kama Shira Shia, what is this amount of time? So Yitzchak Bar Nachmani and one person was with him arguing, who was that? That is Rabbi Shimon Pazi. And that was Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani. It is like the time it takes to say one verse. From the word Vayichru to the end of the verse. And what's the verse? Kol bnei Yisrael ro'im beredes ha'esh v'kvod Hashem ha'bayis Vayichru apayim ha'aretza ha'ritzpa v'yishtachavu v'hodos Hashem kitov kilom chasdo. Which means all of Israel were seeing when the fire was coming down and the glory of God was on the temple, and they bowed down their faces to the ground, and they bowed down and they gave thanks to God, kitov because his kindness endures. So since the Gemara is talking about the Shtachavaya, the Gemara talks about another type of bowing down that's called Kida. The Kida that is mentioned in different places in Sukkah, where Megillah, Kida is al apayim, means your face is on the ground. That's how you bow down. V'chein omer v'tikol bat sheva apayim aretz. It says bat sheva bow down 7 times to the ground. Kriya is al berkayim. Kriya is on the knees. You bow down on the knees. Chein omer mechro al berkav. It says he bowed down on his knees. Ishtachav hazu pisha yadayim raglayim, spreading out the hands. V'chein omer avon avo anim v'mchav v'achefal ishtachavot arza, on the ground. You will say they lay down on the ground. Okay, this is today's daf. It's a beautiful daf. We'll go into much more tomorrow. Shikayach.